It is an enormous honor and privilege to be here. The work that Bumsun Park has done at KAIST in setting up the Center for Anthropocene Studies gives me what little hope I have these days, because in fact, I am very bleak about our future. I do not share the optimism that we just heard voiced, partly because the news every day seems to bring another first. Yesterday, for instance, in my hometown, current hometown of Chicago, we had the worst air quality of any city in the world. In the next 50 years, we are going to have to produce more food than human beings have ever produced in our whole history. And yet we have less than 60 years of soil left, given the way the soil is running off. And the oceans have been depleted such that 90% of the species that we catch are now declining. And of course, I could go on, and each person here could add to this litany of challenges that we face in the Anthropocene. So what do we do? The question for me is to move away from the sense of despair and discouragement that many of these facts tell me are what I ought to feel, and to do what I think those of us in the university are privileged to do and able to do, we hope, which is to think more clearly about this problem and to understand more clearly the challenges we face. That, after all, is our mission. And this is not moving forward. Just did. So what I'm planning to do today is to try to be clear about the terms in which we think of the challenges that we face. And I'm going to use three terms that have become almost interchangeable in public discourse: climate change, the environment, and Anthropocene, and talk about them in terms of historical practice. It's not that these terms are mutually exclusive. I don't want to be heard to be meant to say we can't talk about, if we're talking about one, we can't talk about the other. But each of these terms comes along with a particular science, a particular history, and a particular politics. And we must look at each one very carefully to figure out which dangers it introduces into our thinking. If I put this down, can't hear me, right? Sorry. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about climate change, both in its natural sense, natural climate change, and anthropogenic climate change, which is of course slightly different, the environment, and then two kinds of Anthropocene science, stratigraphy and earth system science, and say that each of these categories allows us to see some things and will occlude other things from our vision. In the end, I'm going to make an argument for Anthropocene history, even though this is a conference on environmental history, because I think that this is the new way in which we need to think about human and natural relations. So I'm going to talk then about Anthropocene history's conceptual challenges at the end of this talk. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm having such a hard time with this thing. Oops. What, it's not going, I need to go. Yeah. let's go to the, so this is, okay, this is going, okay. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. So I'm going to begin with climate science and climate history, because this has become the term of art in many situations now. People are comfortable with the climate change. People used to resist climate change, but now many people have taken it on board. And the idea that we have had a natural climate change over the last 11,700 years of the Holocene has now been accepted. And the work done on that is actually rather recent. In the 60s and 70s, Herbert Lamb in East Anglia coined the terms medieval warming period and little ice age to describe the ways in which the climate has changed naturally over the last 10,000 years. And historians were also involved in this effort and began to be interested in the idea of a flourishing in the Middle Ages that was due to the medieval warming, collapses, particularly in the 18th century, due to the Little Ice Age, and scientists and historians began to work in this mode, natural climate change history. But what has happened is that has given some historians of climate the idea that the climate has always changed and therefore will always change. And there is nothing particularly to get excited about with the idea that the temperature may have risen 1.5, 2 degrees more, 3 degrees more, why not? Because of course, the climate has always changed. So even natural climate change produces this idea of complacency. In this recent book, Peter Frankopan actually says this directly without ever noting, of course, that human beings have never flourished at these much higher temperatures, or suggesting that we might have real difficulties in dealing with such challenges. But there have been historians who have taken on natural climate change and done really, really interesting things with that idea, particularly to do with East Asia. And then there have been several of them, but I'm going to use Geoffrey Parker's extraordinary book, The Global Crisis, where he chose to put together the general crisis, which were the wars of religion in Europe, with the Little Ice Age, which was a global phenomenon. And when he began to look globally, that general crisis in Europe turned out to be just a small smidgen of the death and disaster that was in fact global during this time. Europe suffered from war. In fact, it only had 4 years of peace at the worst times of the Little Ice Age in the 18th century. But China had no years of peace during this period. And indeed, as you look around the globe, death and destruction happens in almost every society as people lose the capacity to feed themselves and rebellions and war break out. But Japan, as Geoffrey Parker points out, was different. In Japan, there were at most only 4 years of war. And in fact, as the Tokugawa Bakufu settled into power, it managed to establish a peace that allows Parker to say, Japan gets it right. And this means that he can say to us that climate change can be very bad. And in fact, most of the time, our reaction to it isn't particularly good. However, we can get it right with the right sort of politics. And he says it is statecraft above all else in its dedication to peace, to welfare, to technological innovation, and good luck that allows Japan to overcome its climate conditions. It certainly has famines, in fact, very bad famines. And yet, because the government has set up, for instance, granaries to feed the poor, Japan makes it through this time. So Parker is looking at natural climate change and explaining that there are moments in which countries have managed to navigate a way through it. And what is even more remarkable is that Japan not only produced peace and prosperity, but in the 18th century, its population leveled off, which allowed it to gain enough wealth so that when Western colonialists came knocking at their door, they were able to push back. But of course, natural climate change isn't what we're facing today. We're facing anthropogenic climate change, human-made climate change. And this is a phenomenon which we've known about for a good long time. In fact, it was a woman named Eunice Foote who in 1856 discovered that CO2 was raising temperatures in the atmosphere, and that human beings were emitting more CO2. Of course, John Tyndall got the recognition for that, but Eunice did it first. And we now know that this anthropogenic climate change is rather extraordinary. In fact, very extraordinary. This is actually an old graph. It seems like we have now raised the global average temperature more than it's been in almost 1 million years. So what have historians done with this fact? Many historians have jumped on climate change, and we've gotten excited about explaining anthropogenic climate change and how we can tell our stories about it. And that's a very good thing, except so too have the corporations grasped this concept and turned it into something that is a mere problem that we can solve. And I want to turn to the way they do this here, which is to turn climate change into simply the emissions of CO2, forgetting about methane and other greenhouse gases, and then wanting to talk about CO2 emissions only from the burning of fossil fuels in transport and energy, setting aside, for instance, agriculture, and setting aside things like concrete production and lots of other activities that are also producing greenhouse gases. And this narrowing of the problem allows them to feel that it's a solvable problem. Indeed, the American Environmental Protection Agency just recently suggested that we could burn plastics in jet fuel and that would be a renewable solution, despite the fact that tests show that this would give a rise of 25% in the cancer rates in human beings. But corporations had loved this idea. Our friend Bill Gates has styled himself as a hero of climate change solution. And for those of you who have read this book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, he sets himself up in what can only be termed as the great white man hero. The book opens with Bill flying over the dark continent of Africa and looking down at the poor little dark children sitting in the dark who cannot read. But he, Bill, will bring them light through small-scale nuclear reactors. And he will then be able to look down on the dark continent as an illuminated jewel in the planet Earth. And he will know that those little dark boys will be able to read. I kid you not, this beginning of the chapter is exactly framed in this appalling way. And you would think that with his money, he could hire a better ghostwriter. he could also hire a few scientists, and they might suggest a bill that if you illuminate the entire continent of Africa, you're also going to harm a lot of biodiversity in Africa. A lot of birds, for instance, like the turtle dove that used to arrive in England for Christmas, needs darkness to fly. So light pollution is a problem. Light is good, it solves some problems, but it also makes other problems. And this is why framing our difficulties in terms of just climate change is such a disaster. We all know that wind turbines, solar power, electrification can help us somewhat, but they always must be balanced with the dangers that they also cause. For instance, rare earth minerals are sourced in just a few places in Earth, China more than any other place, and the labor conditions there are appalling. It's also these extractive industries that, in the end, destroy biodiversity more than anything. These lithium batteries that are supposed to solve our problems, in just the UK alone, would require huge more amounts of lithium, cobalt, and graphite. The thin white line is what we use now, the dark line is what's to come. So what I want to do is flag climate change as a problem for historians. There are wonderful books about climate change. The ones up here on the screen are all fabulous books. They are attentive to the need to make some headway in reducing our demands for energy. But they also run the risk of being complicit in conveying to society that climate change is our only difficulty and we can solve it. So let me turn now to the rubric of the environment. The idea that the environment is the way we should look at these issues. And certainly the environment is what spurred environmental history. And it's an important concept, but it too comes with dangers. And the dangers of the environment are a certain stress on continuity that arises out of the moment in which environmental history was formed, particularly in the United States. The United States in the 1970s, when Nixon was in office, was collective in its desire to face pollution problems. Pollution was something we needed to solve, so we could do this by setting up an EPA. Everybody agreed that new policies were needed, and we could adopt this rubric of the environment and then solve these problems by narrow policy changes without changing our system. And perhaps we could have if we'd done what we really set out to do in the 1970s. But what it suggested in its formation in environmental history was that problems were local and they could be addressed by local policy, which means that many environmental historians then think that the problems we are facing are local problems that happen in different times and different places, which is true, but inadequate to the current situation of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is not a series of local environmental problems. The Anthropocene is a global problem because it is a change in Earth system functioning. We have another quote from another president of the American Society for Environmental History, who tells us that the Anthropocene is merely a will-o'-the-wisp. It's really hard to pin down. It's not really something we need to think about, because the fact of environmental degradation is neither a novel nor unprecedented circumstance. So I think we need to be very careful as we look back at our own formation as a discipline, so that we understand how the environment and the stress on the local and the stress on continuities and the idea that human beings have always been part of the environment blind us to the radicality of what's going on now. So we now have some new histories of the environment, which stress not only the radicality now, but also the radicality at the origins of the very concept of the environment. When Fairfield Osborn, without access to concepts like Earth system, was beginning to realize that the entire global system was under threat from human activities. And he's doing this in the middle of the 20th century. So the authors of this book, Paul Ward, Libby Robin, and Sverker Sorlin, are telling us that we need to look at environmental history in terms of its culmination now in the Anthropocene, which they define as an integrated Earth system impact by human beings. That's what our environmental history now must mean, not simply local engagements. So let me now turn finally to the Anthropocene. I only have a few more minutes, so I will be quick here. There are two sciences that contribute to the notion of the Anthropocene, and which our new form of Anthropocene history needs to take into account. Earth system science and geology. I'm going to talk about these two sciences separately, but they are pointing to the same phenomenon. As Will Steffen pointed out in 2016, both Earth system science and geostratigraphy are telling us that human activities transformed the planet in the middle of the 20th century. But I'm going to pull apart these sciences because of what's happening in the science itself. Simon Turner, who will speak to you next, will talk about the stratigraphic Anthropocene and where the Anthropocene Working Group is today. But I would like to comment on their processes from the perspective of a historian, because I'm worried about the disputes amongst scientists. The Anthropocene Working Group has uncovered, as I understand it, incredibly compelling evidence that we have truly transformed the planet and laid down a new layer of strata that mark human interference. But there are very powerful figures in the geological community. Stan Finney, who's head of the ICS, Phil Gibbard, Earl Ellis, who are doing their best to knock down the Anthropocene as a geological concept, as a geological epoch, and are trying to introduce this idea of an event lasting about 50,000 years. And they very strangely invited historians and humanists to join them in thinking about this 50,000-year event, which is not something that historians and humanists are used to doing, thinking in terms of 50,000 years. And there's not a lot of physical evidence for a 50,000-year event. And Simon can, of course, speak to this much better than I can. So there are distractions within the scientific field, which means that for those of us in history, it becomes very important to understand that even as geostratigraphers are struggling with the Anthropocene epoch as a formal geological designation, we in history can still work with this term because it still makes a lot of sense in terms of Earth system science. Earth system, the whole concept of the Earth system was developed in 1986 by NASA when they decided that the Earth as a unit could be studied with the help of computers, that it operated as a single integrated entity. And it was out of Earth system science that Paul Cruikshank at a conference came up with the very term Anthropocene in the year 2000. And his surmise was that the Anthropocene probably began in the late 18th century with the development of the steam engine. But they didn't have the data going back to the 18th century. So the International Geosphere-Biosphere Program got information going all the way back to the 18th century. And the Anthropocene didn't begin then. Every single graph on this chart shows that the big change came in the middle of the 20th century. And that becomes the compelling question for historians. How on earth did it come to be that in the middle of the 20th century, human activities ratcheted up globally so that we impacted the entire Earth system and transformed the way the Earth system works? Human beings have always had environmental impacts. We have never been Earth system agencies, agents impacting the Earth's crust, for instance, as Jaya Savitsky shows, by moving so much sediment in the years between 2010 and going back to 1950. 4 times as much sediment has been moved as has been moved in the entire history of human beings. Sorry. So we are really begun to change the way the Earth system functions. And for historians, this gives us a very different object to study. Sorry. This object is a human-dominated planet. This doesn't mean we need to abandon our regional and local histories. Those are still important. But we must always understand that we need to navigate between these local stories and this unprecedented, unpredictable, irreversible change to Earth, a new object of study. And our disciplines and our new object of study will require new archives. That means working with Earth system scientists and geologists. We also need to think in terms of a new agency. We still need to maintain our sense of individual agency, community agency, and national agency, but we must realize now that we have attained Earth system agency. And for Earth system agency, we have never developed the theories of politics or ethics that have informed our other histories. I'm going to skip. And we need to have a new politics. Justice has been based in the modern period as the hope for growth so that there's greater liberty and greater distribution to everyone. Now we can no longer aim for justice on the basis of infinite growth. Instead, our hope must be resilience with decency. This is a very different politics, framed with non-utopian hopes, so of habitable societies within planetary boundaries. So what we're attempting to do now with the new politics is to move our aims away from the hope of greater and greater abundance for us all towards the idea of a stabilized Earth system within boundaries. This in Anthropocene history is very experimental these days. We still haven't gotten there yet, but we need to move away from the siloed thinking of climate history to systems thinking. We need to move away from the notion of a continuity in human history to the radical change in human history that emerged in the mid-20th century. We need to become literate with the Earth system sciences and geology and work with those scientists. And we need to find a new framework for the future and a new form of history. Thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry for my problem with the slides.